Okay, the three main processes of a river are erosion, transportation, and deposition. So, erosion, and I'm pretty sure that you have an idea of what erosion is. A river causes erosion to happen. Once erosion has happened, everything that is eroded needs to be transported. And the river has flow, a stream has flow. So when it is eroded, the same flow, the stream flow or the river flow, the energy in the river causes for everything that was eroded to move. And at some point, that river is no longer strong enough to keep on moving everything that it is carrying, and it has to deposit it somewhere. So these are the three things that happen in a river. And we're going to look at each one of them individually, right? So erosion. What is erosion? Erosion is the gradual removal of parts of land by any means, meaning that wind can cause erosion, water can cause erosion, people can cause erosion, animals can cause erosion, plants can cause erosion. There are a numerous amount of things that can cause erosion, but for this specific topic, we are talking about water erosion, the erosion that is caused by water movement in rivers. And we're going to talk about 4 different ways that this can happen. You have by solution, by hydraulic action, by abrasion, and by attrition. So these are the 4 ways how erosion can happen in a river. All right? If I am moving too fast in the slides, you guys can tell me to pause a minute and I can do that, right? So here we have an image of a river, and this is a river. If a river is flowing in one direction, I split the river, so that's why the image looks like this, right? So it's like you're looking in front of the river dissection. Here you have the solution, hydraulic action, abrasion, and attrition, and these 4 things are labeled here in this diagram. Now we're gonna talk about solution. How does solution erosion happen? River water can dissolve some of the minerals in rocks. So an example of this. If you have a glass of water and you add salt to that water, or you add sugar to that water, I take a spoon and I just throw it in, automatically some of it gets dissolved. I don't even have to move it. I don't even have to touch it. Some of it already gets dissolved, right? That is what happens. River water, that water automatically, it doesn't even have to do anything, automatically dissolves some of the rocks, some of the soil that is in there, right? So just the presence of the water causes for erosion to happen just by having it there. Looking at hydraulic action, and then you see solution is right here, and I don't think that you can clearly see it in the picture, but it does have some little particles that are in there in the arrow that is pointing for solution. Now hydraulic action, this is the force of the river water itself acting on the bed and banks. So if you guys have been to a river or have seen a river, you know that the water is flowing in one direction. The action of the force of water, because there has to be energy, there has to be force for the water to move. That movement, when the water hits on the side, on the riverbanks, that causes for cracks to happen in the soil. It doesn't automatically, okay, the water touches it and boom, it falls off. No, it touches and touches and touches, and while it's flowing and flowing and flowing, that constant flow of water causes cracks to happen in the riverbanks. And those cracks later on cause for the soil to erode away, and that's why in most cases rivers get wider and wider because erosion is happening on the riverbanks. So that's why for hydraulic action, it is pointing at the cracks that are on the riverbanks. Abrasion or corrosion. Those words mean the same thing, just two words to talk about the same thing. But abrasion or corrosion is the process by which stones, sand grains, or other particles carried by the river are thrown against the bed or the banks. So, solution is automatically things that are dissolved in the water. Hydraulic action is the movement hitting against the water bank, the movement of the water. Abrasion is the things that the river is carrying. Because the river is moving, those things are hitting against each other, and they're hitting against each other, and they're also hitting against the banks. And those things could be soil, could be other things that are found in the river, could be rocks, and those rocks or soil or whatever material it is that is moving in the river is hitting against the bank, and that is causing for erosion to happen. So if I have a rock and the rock is moving, but the rock is there hitting and hitting and hitting against the river bank, because the river is moving, it is there bouncing and it is rolling. That same hitting and that same rolling that is happening is causing for the river bank to break off or to erode. And then the last one is attrition. And attrition is stones and rocks carried downstream are thrown against each other. So abrasion and attrition work hand in hand. If I have rocks, abrasion is the rock hitting against the riverbank. And attrition are when the rocks hit against each other. So when they're hitting each other, they're bouncing off one another. And if I were to do that, if I were to take two rocks and I hit them, and I hit them, and I hit them, and I hit them, I would see dust particles that are falling off of it, or maybe little pieces of the rock are falling off of it. And that is the same thing that happens in the river when you have stones and rocks hitting against each other. Anybody has any questions that I just explained? No questions? Okay, so let's continue. Transport. Okay. Transport is what it is, what it says right here. Transportation, the movement. So how does a river move things? We have talked about how it erodes, how a river does erosion, but now we want to know how does a river move all of those things. So after it has rocks, after it has hit the riverbanks, after it has made more soil at the bottom of the river, how does the river move that? And what are the different ways that that movement occurs? And we have 4 ways: solution, traction, suspension, and saltation. Solution is some minerals are dissolved. So this solution is the same solution as erosion, right? When in the first solution erosion, we talked about how some soil particles are automatically dissolved. And because they're automatically dissolved, that flows with the water. I can't stop it. I can't put a net there and say, okay, what is dissolved is going to stay here. Once it is dissolved, I can't take it out. All right? If you were to put sugar in your coffee and you mix it, can you take out the sugar back? It's already dissolved. I can't remove it. And that's the same thing that happens in solution. Once it is dissolved, it's gonna move with the water. I have suspension. Fine clay particles float along in the river. And why does it say clay? Because clay cannot be dissolved in water. Previously, I did explain that clay, water cannot pass easily through clay, and that's why you have clay floating in the water, because it does not dissolve, it cannot mix with the water, so those little particles are just floating there. If you have went to, for example, you go to the seaside and you get in the water right on the coast, if you are there where the sand is, and you walk maybe like 4 steps in the water, you can put in your hand, and when you lift it up, you are picking up soil. You didn't touch the bottom of the surface of the sea. All you did was just stick your hand there and you lifted up some soil or some clay or some sand. That is what we call suspension, because it does not dissolve in the water, it is just there floating around. We have traction, which is stones and boulders are rolling along the riverbed. So these are just stones that are too heavy to be lifted and to be carried by the water. The energy of the river just rolls them around and rolls them and rolls them. So it can't lift it up and carry it, and the stone is too heavy to float. So all it can do is just roll it. And the rolling movement is what we call traction. And the last one is called saltation. And that is when you have particles that are bouncing. Right? In Spanish, jump is saltar, and that is where this word comes from, saltation. And that just means that you have things that are jumping and jumping and jumping. They are too heavy to float, and they are too light to be rolled, so they are just jumping on the bed of the river. Anybody has any questions?
No, miss.
Okay. And then the last one we have deposition. Now, deposition is basically when you have the erosion happening, when you have the transportation happening, at some point, the river is no longer strong enough to continue carrying all of these things. So usually when a river is coming down or moving from a higher place to a lower place, the energy is really, really strong, and you have current in that river. But now when a river is flowing in a parallel direction to the surface where it is, the energy in the river or the current isn't as strong enough. So for example, if you have gone into a river, there are pieces and portions of a river where they tell you don't go because the current is too strong. And there are pieces of a river where you can get in and you can sit down there because the current, you can feel the little currents in the river, but it's not strong enough that it can pull you away. So this is where deposition happens, when the energy of the river is no longer strong enough to carry these things. Now, deposition happens in order of size. Usually the first things that a river tends to deposit are big rocks and big boulders, because those are the ones that take more energy to move. So as you can see in the diagram, a river has energy and the energy starts to decrease, right, in the arrow right here. And you can see it in the waves that are happening, and at some point it just stops. There is no more current. So as the energy of the river and the currents of a river are decreasing, then that is how they begin deposition. Rocks, large rocks and large boulders are deposited first. You have gravel and smaller stones being deposited, and then that decreases into having clay, silt, and sand being deposited last. And that's why at some portions you have very soft, if you walk into certain portions of a water body, it has a lot of rocks. It's very hard for you to walk in those places. And then in other pieces you have, it's soft because it's clay or it's sand that is there, and you can easily move around. That is the portion of the river where there is no more current or there is almost no current at all. Anybody has any questions? No questions? Then I have questions for you. I have one diagram here, and I have 4 words at the top. I have suspension, deposition, saltation, traction. And you have to label this diagram. So I have the first one here. You have an arrow that is showing a bounce. What would that bounce represent? Which one of these 4?
Saltation.
Saltation. Very good. Saltation. So I'm going to move. Saltation right here. Okay. I have the other one. I have a big boulder, and it's showing a forward moving, so that boulder is rolling. What do we call when something is rolling? Suspension, deposition, or traction? Anybody? What do we call when a boulder or when a large rock rolls? I see traction. Very good in the chat. So I'm gonna put traction. Now I have here particles floating. Particles that cannot be dissolved, but they're floating right here in the water. What do we call that? Is it called suspension or deposition? Suspension. Very good. So I'm moving suspension. And then now, what do we call when the particles or the rocks or whatever just settle at the bottom of the riverbed? We call that deposition. Alright? And there we go. We have labeled the diagram. Now, your assignment is to create one like this. The assignment that I have posted in Google Classroom asked you to create a diagram of a river that shows one way of erosion, one way of transportation, and one way of deposition. Here I have 2 ways of transportation. You only need to do one, right? So I need to see 3 things being labeled in your diagram. You can put suspension, and then in brackets you put erosion, you put traction, and in brackets you put transport, and then deposition. Well, deposition is just deposition. But I want to see at least 3 things. You are free to put more of them if you can include them in your diagram. For example, here I have 4, but I only need to see 3 of them. You may go ahead and be creative with your drawing, color your drawing, add fishes to your drawing, I don't know, add a boat to your drawing, whatever you add to your drawing, but that is in addition to what I am asking for. Is that clear to everybody what you have to do?
Yes, Miss. Miss, do we to do it in a bristol board or in a typing sheet?
On a typing sheet.
Okay, Miss. Thank you.
On a typing sheet. That is the smallest I want it. I don't want something smaller than a typing sheet. And I don't want something bigger than a Bristol board, because you have to take a picture of it. You either take a picture of it, you either scan it, or you find how it is that you're uploading it in Google Classroom. Alright? Now, the assignments are uploaded separately. So the first assignment is here, the one that we spoke about last class, and then this is the second one, the one that I'm explaining today. All right. So